The gods had always been creatures of power and mystery, their wills shaping the heavens, the earth, and the very lives of those who walked beneath them. But even among these immortal beings, there was a sense of something missing, an empty space that needed to be filled. And so, with the flick of a divine hand, the first woman was born. Her name was Pandora, and her creation would forever change the world. It began on a day when the gods gathered on Mount Olympus, their thoughts heavy with purpose and revenge. Zeus, king of the gods, stood in the center, his eyes cold, his mind focused. His anger toward the mortals was consuming, and he needed a way to teach them a lesson, one that would echo throughout history. He needed to create something they could not resist, something beautiful, yet dangerous, a temptation wrapped in mortal skin. And so, Pandora was born. From the moment she took form, she was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Her skin shimmered with an ethereal glow, pale as moonlight, yet with the warmth of the earth beneath it. Every step she took seemed to cause the air to shift around her, a soft breeze following her wherever she went. Her hair, dark and silken, cascaded down her shoulders like a river of midnight, and her eyes, oh, her eyes, held the depth of 1,000 secrets, the spark of curiosity that would forever define her. She was perfection, a living goddess, her beauty crafted to entrance. But beauty alone was not enough for the gods. No, they had something more in mind for Pandora. Each god would give her a gift, a divine blessing that would shape her into a being of great complexity. Aphrodite, the goddess of love, gifted Pandora with an irresistible charm that made every mortal's heart beat faster in her presence. Athena, wise and regal, bestowed upon her the gift of intelligence and cunning. Hera, queen of marriage, gave Pandora the power to captivate and hold the affections of men, while Demeter, goddess of the harvest, gave her the warmth of nurturing hands and the ability to bring life from the earth. Even the dark gods, those whose powers lay in shadows, left their mark. Hermes gave Pandora the gift of speech, so sweet and persuasive it could calm storms and stir hearts. Apollo, god of the sun, gifted her with a voice that could sing like the morning birds, yet with a softness that could bring tears to the eyes of even the hardest of men. But Zeus, king of the gods, gave her the most important gift of all, a box. A small, delicate jar, carved from the finest wood and bound with gold. Its contents were unknown, even to Pandora herself, but it was meant to be a symbol of her fate, a warning. She was given one simple instruction: do not open the box. Yet, despite all the gifts the gods had bestowed upon her, Pandora's existence came with a price. She was created to be both a blessing and a curse, a beautiful paradox. She was the very embodiment of hope and destruction, a creature whose heart could bring joy or sorrow, whose curiosity could lead to salvation or ruin. She was the gods' creation, their tool, but also their experiment. In the eyes of the gods, Pandora was a masterpiece, a creation meant to entice and to punish. Yet, what they failed to realize was the weight they placed upon her. They made her beautiful, yes, but they also gave her a burden, one she would carry through the ages. The ancient world was a place where the gods watched from above, their eyes ever present, their judgments swift and final. Mortals lived in constant fear of angering the gods, their lives controlled by the whims of the divine. Women, in particular, were bound by the expectations of those who created them. They were meant to be wives, daughters, mothers, objects of beauty, but also symbols of virtue and obedience. The society around Pandora was one where beauty was both a blessing and a trap, where women were praised for their grace and charm, but often punished for the same traits. Their worth was tied to their ability to serve, to remain quiet, to remain unseen. Pandora was to be a reflection of this world, a living symbol of the expectations that bound women's lives. Though she was adored by those who saw her, she was also a reminder of the roles women were expected to play. She would be admired, loved, but never truly free. Her beauty would define her, but it would also be her cage. And though the gods gave her many gifts, they failed to give her the one thing she truly needed: freedom. As Pandora stood before the gods, her heart heavy with the weight of their expectations, she could not know what her future would hold. She had been shaped by divine hands, her very existence a reflection of the gods' will. But there was something in her, a flicker, a spark, that set her apart. She was not just the sum of her gifts, not merely a creature of beauty and charm. No, Pandora was something more. She was a woman, born into a world where men controlled everything, where even her curiosity could be her undoing. And yet, in the quiet moments, when no one was watching, when she stood alone in the shadows of Olympus, Pandora felt it, a stir in her chest, a question without an answer, a desire to know more. To understand the world beyond the boundaries set for her, to see what lay beyond the perfection of her form. There was something deeper inside her, something the gods did not give her, something that would drive her to seek the truth. The box, of course, was a symbol of this. It was a gift, yes, but it was also a prison. A beautiful, gilded prison, one that would both tempt and torment her. The gods had crafted her to be the perfect woman, yet they had left her with a puzzle, a riddle, one that would challenge her very essence. In that moment, as she stood in the divine light of Olympus, Pandora was both a creation of beauty and a prisoner of destiny. She was the first of her kind, a woman molded by the gods to fulfill a purpose she could not yet understand. And as she gazed out into the world, her heart filled with both wonder and trepidation, for she knew that she would be the one to bear the weight of all that the gods had set into motion. The air on Mount Olympus was thick with tension. The gods sat in their grand hall, their eyes fixed upon Zeus, who stood at the center of them all, his expression hard and unreadable. The thunder above rolled in response to his mood, dark clouds gathering as though they too understood the weight of his words. Zeus had made his decision. He had already shaped the fate of humanity by giving them fire, the gift of Prometheus that had angered him beyond measure. Now, he felt that a greater punishment was needed, one that would ensure mankind would never forget their place. And so, the first woman was to be created, Pandora. "Let her be a gift," Zeus declared, his voice like the rumble of distant storms. "A gift to mankind. But a gift they will not want. I will shape her to be their undoing." The gods watched him silently, each knowing their part in this grand design. Hera, his wife, raised an eyebrow, her regal presence cool and calculating. She had long known the ways of manipulation, and the creation of Pandora intrigued her, though she did not fully understand Zeus' plan. "How do you intend to use her, my lord?" Hera asked, her voice smooth like honey, yet carrying an edge. "What role will this woman play in our scheme?" Zeus' eyes flashed, the storm swirling more violently around them. "She will be both beautiful and deadly, a weapon in disguise. With her, I will punish humanity for their arrogance. She will possess gifts from each of us, charms that will beguile them, trap them in their desires. But in the end, she will bring about their downfall." A murmur passed through the gods as they exchanged looks of both curiosity and concern. They understood the consequences of Zeus' will. To create Pandora was to invite a series of events none could predict. Aphrodite, goddess of love, stepped forward with a knowing smile. She was already intrigued by the idea of a woman born from the will of the gods, for she understood the power that beauty could wield. She had seen it before, in the glances of men, in the way they would give everything for the love of a woman. "I shall grant her beauty," Aphrodite said, her voice sweet, yet heavy with power. "The kind of beauty that no man can resist. Let her face be like the first rays of dawn, her eyes like the deep blue of the ocean, soft, inviting, and filled with wonder. But this beauty will be a mask. Underneath, she will carry the weight of all we wish to bestow upon her." Zeus nodded. Beauty would be the first gift. But it was only the beginning. Athena, goddess of wisdom, was next. She had watched the mortals with her sharp eyes for eons, and though they were clever in their own way, they were still easily deceived. She knew what Pandora would need to survive in a world that would inevitably seek to destroy her. "I will grant her wisdom," Athena declared. "A sharpness to see through lies, to understand the minds of those around her. But this wisdom will be a curse. She will see the truth of things, even the darkest truths. And in knowing them, she will be burdened by them." There was no mistaking the gravity in Athena's voice. Pandora would know what others could not, what no mortal should know. She would carry the weight of the world's secrets, forced to witness the unraveling of everything she held dear. Next came Hermes, the god of messages and trickery. He smiled, a glint of mischief in his eyes, knowing well that there was no human alive who could resist the temptations of Pandora. With a light laugh, he stepped forward. "I shall grant her speech," he said, his voice full of charm. A voice so sweet that men will hang on every word she speaks. She will have the power to persuade and deceive with nothing more than her words. But even this will be dangerous. Words, once spoken, can never be taken back. Zeus was pleased with the gift so far, but he knew that Pandora would need more than beauty, wisdom, and charm to carry out his will. He turned to Apollo, the god of the sun and truth. The light in Apollo's eyes flickered for a moment, as if he understood the complexity of what was being done. "I will grant her the gift of song," Apollo declared, his voice rich with authority. "Her voice will be so beautiful, so enchanting, that it will draw all those around her into her orbit. She will sing of the joys of life, but with a sorrowful undertone, a reminder that nothing is truly free." Zeus smiled, but it was a dark smile. Pandora would be a song of hope and despair, her every note a reminder of the eternal struggle between the two. It was Demeter, goddess of the harvest, who stepped forward last, her face thoughtful as she considered her contribution. She knew that without the ability to nurture, to give life, Pandora would not be a true woman, she would be incomplete. "I will grant her the gift of nurturing," Demeter said softly. "She will have the ability to bring warmth to the coldest hearts, to heal and care for others. But this gift, too, will be a burden. For she will care for those who may not care for her in return." The gods looked at one another, their expressions a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. They had each given Pandora a gift, yet none of them could see the full picture. They were blinded by their own motives, their own visions of what Pandora could become. Zeus, however, saw the full scope of what was to come. Pandora would be beautiful and intelligent, charming and persuasive. She would be the perfect creation, perfect and yet doomed. For the box, the one gift they had all ignored, was a reflection of their true intentions. Pandora would not only carry the beauty and wisdom of the gods, she would carry their punishment as well. "Let her be all of these things," Zeus said, his voice quiet but final. "But she will also be the tool of mankind's destruction. For in her beauty, they will find their downfall. In her wisdom, they will see too much. In her voice, they will hear their doom." The gods nodded, their part in the creation of Pandora complete. They could not see the future that Pandora would shape, but they had shaped her destiny. The stage was set, and there was no turning back. Prometheus stood on the edge of the mountain, the winds howling around him like a chorus of whispers from the gods. His heart pounded with the weight of the decision he had made, a decision that would echo through time and change the fate of mankind forever. He could feel the heat of the divine fire in his hands, its warmth a promise of something greater, something brighter. It was forbidden, it was dangerous, and it was exactly what humanity needed. For eons, the humans below had lived in darkness, their lives ruled by ignorance, fear, and cold. They huddled together, barely surviving, struggling against the elements, with no light to guide their way. It was a world of endless night, where the fire of the gods burned only for the immortals, never for the fragile mortals who scraped by beneath them. Prometheus watched them, his heart aching for the suffering he saw. The gods were above, living in luxury and power, while those they had created below were left to suffer. He could no longer stand by and watch. So, he made his choice. Stealing fire from the gods was a crime, a bold defiance of Zeus and the divine order. The gods had kept it for themselves, as a symbol of their dominance. Fire was the essence of life, the force that could warm the earth, cook food, and provide the light of knowledge. It was something only they could possess, something that mortals could never have. And yet, Prometheus, a titan, saw it differently. He had always believed in the potential of humans, in their ability to grow, to learn, and to become more than what the gods had intended them to be. They were not just playthings for the gods, not simply pawns in their celestial games. No, they were something more. They were deserving of fire, of light, of hope. In the dead of night, when Olympus was cloaked in its eternal glow, Prometheus descended. He crept into the sacred halls of the gods, where fire burned in endless supply. He took the flame, a gift that was not his to give, and carried it back to the humans, hidden in a hollow reed. With that single act, he defied Zeus, and in doing so, he brought the gift of fire to the mortals. The humans, weak and fragile as they were, stared at the flame in awe. They had never seen such a thing, and the promise of warmth and light in their cold, dark world filled them with wonder. With fire, they could cook their food, forge tools, and build. It was as if the very sky had opened to them, and the world had been lit anew. For the first time, humanity felt as if they had a chance, a spark of hope that could change their lives forever. But Zeus was not a god who would tolerate such rebellion. His rage was swift and unyielding. When he learned of Prometheus' treachery, his anger shook the heavens themselves. How dare a mere titan defy his will? How dare Prometheus give such a gift to creatures beneath the gods? It was a betrayal, a challenge to the very order that Zeus had so carefully crafted. Prometheus' heart sank as he realized the full consequences of his actions. The fire was a gift, yes, but it came with a price. It had sparked a fire in humanity, a flame that could not be extinguished. Zeus would punish Prometheus for daring to defy him, and the punishment would be brutal. Zeus summoned the gods to his throne, his voice like thunder as he decreed Prometheus' fate. He would not be killed, no, that would be too easy. Instead, Zeus had something far worse in mind. Prometheus was bound to a jagged rock, high in the mountains, where no mortal could reach him. Each day, an eagle would come and tear at his liver, devouring it piece by piece. And each night, the liver would regenerate, only to be torn apart again with the coming of dawn. It was an eternal torment, a punishment that would last as long as the gods willed it. As the chains were placed around him, Prometheus did not cry out in pain. He stood tall, defiant, though every part of him burned with agony. He had given humanity fire, and though Zeus sought to break him, he knew that his defiance had sparked something greater than himself. The fire would remain with the mortals, and nothing the gods could do would take it away. Zeus' wrath was not limited to Prometheus alone. He was determined to make an example of the humans who had been gifted the fire. In his mind, they were no better than animals, unworthy of the knowledge and power they now possessed. He could not allow them to think they were on equal footing with the gods. The fire had made them too bold, too independent. And so, as a punishment to both Prometheus and mankind, Zeus devised a new plan, one that would leave humanity forever marked by the consequences of their defiance. He called upon Hephaestus, the god of blacksmiths, and commanded him to create the first woman. A woman who would be both beautiful and terrifying, a woman who would embody the desires of men, yet bring suffering in her wake. The woman would be Pandora, a gift to mankind, but a gift designed to undo the very thing that Prometheus had started. Pandora would be perfect, crafted by the gods to tempt and to destroy. Her beauty would lead men astray, her charm would bind them to her, and in her hands, she would hold a box that would hold the very things that could ruin them. Pandora's creation was not just a punishment for Prometheus, it was a punishment for all of humanity. Zeus wanted to remind them that no matter how much fire they had, no matter how much knowledge they gained, they were still beneath the gods. They would never be free. Prometheus, bound to his rock, could do nothing to stop it. He could only watch as the gods put their plan into motion. The fire he had given them, the gift he had hoped would elevate them, had become their greatest curse. The very thing that had brought them hope now set them on a path to destruction. But even in his agony, Prometheus held on to one truth: humanity had the fire. And that fire would never be extinguished. It would burn forever, in the hearts of men and women alike, lighting the way through the darkness. The gods could punish, could torment, could manipulate, but they could not take away the fire. That, Prometheus knew, would always be theirs. Prometheus stood at the edge of the world, his eyes fixed on the darkness below. The world of mortals seemed so small, so fragile from where he stood, but it was their suffering that weighed on him, pulling at his heart. They were living in the cold, stumbling through life with no light, no hope, trapped in a world where the fire of knowledge, the flame of life, was kept from them. It was a cruelty that could not be ignored. He could no longer stand by and watch. His mind raced, a plan taking shape. He had seen it before, the light the gods enjoyed, the warmth of the fire that burned brightly in the halls of Mount Olympus. It was theirs alone. But why? Why should the gods have all the light, while mankind stumbled in the dark? What were the gods if not selfish, holding power over the helpless mortals below? A rebellious thought began to grow inside him, and it was a thought that would change everything. He had never been like the other titans, obedient, unquestioning, accepting of the gods' rule. He had always believed in something greater than their petty games. He believed in the humans, in their potential, in their ability to become more than what they were. But for them to rise, for them to thrive, they needed the gift of fire. Without it, they were nothing. With it, they could grow, they could build, they could create. And so, in a moment that would define his existence, Prometheus decided. He would steal fire from the gods, the very thing they guarded so jealously, and give it to the mortals. It was an act of rebellion, a challenge to the power of Zeus himself. But it was also a gift to the humans who needed it more than anyone could imagine. Under the cover of night, when Olympus slept, Prometheus made his move. He crept through the halls of the gods, past their treasures, past their secrets, until he found the sacred flame that burned in the center of their domain. The flame, the light that had always been theirs, was the symbol of their dominance. Without it, they would be no different from the mortals they looked down upon. But Prometheus saw it differently. To him, the flame was not a weapon to be hoarded but a gift to be shared. And so, with careful hands, he stole it, taking the fire from the gods and hiding it within a hollow reed. It was a dangerous act, one that could cost him everything, but he could not turn back. The humans below needed this gift. It was their birthright, and he would see to it that they had it. When he brought the fire to them, the humans were stunned. They had never seen such a thing, never felt warmth in the way it spread through their bodies, never known light that could banish the darkness. They were awed by it, and their eyes shone with a spark of something more, something they had never known before. They could now cook food, they could protect themselves from the cold, and most of all, they could forge their future. They could build. They could rise. But what Prometheus didn't know, what no one could have known, was how the gods would react. Zeus, the king of the gods, was not one to tolerate such defiance. His rule was absolute, his power unquestioned. The very idea that a mere titan, one of his own kind, would steal from him, would challenge his authority, ignited a fury in Zeus like no other. How dare Prometheus give fire to the humans? How dare he defy the divine order? Zeus, in his rage, could not see the deeper meaning behind Prometheus' actions. To him, it was nothing but an insult, a challenge to his throne. The gods had always been above humanity, and this act of rebellion threatened to tear apart the delicate balance they had maintained for eons. In an instant, Zeus made his decision. He would punish Prometheus in a way that would make the Titan regret his choice for all eternity. But it wasn't just Prometheus who would suffer. No, Zeus knew that the fire could not be taken back, but he would find a way to make sure that mankind never truly benefited from it. They would always know the cost of this gift. The punishment for Prometheus was swift and brutal. He was bound to a jagged rock in the farthest corner of the world, where no one could reach him. Day after day, an eagle would come and tear at his liver, feasting on it, while the Titan could do nothing but endure the agony. And each night, as the sun set, his liver would regenerate, only to be torn apart again with the coming of dawn. This was his punishment, a torment that would last for as long as the gods decided. But the gods were not done. Zeus, never one to leave a challenge unanswered, had another punishment in mind. He could not allow the mortals to think they had gained anything from Prometheus' gift. The fire had given them hope, had made them bold, and that was a dangerous thing. They were still too weak, too insignificant in the eyes of the gods. They could never rise to a level where they would be truly free. And so, In his anger, Zeus called upon Hephaestus, the god of fire and craftsmanship, and ordered him to create the first woman. A woman who would be both beautiful and dangerous, a woman who would embody both desire and destruction. Her name would be Pandora, and she would be sent to the humans as a gift, but a gift with a hidden price. Pandora would be perfect in every way. She would have beauty that no man could resist, a charm that would ensnare them, and a curiosity that would lead them to their doom. In her hands, Zeus placed a box that would hold all the evils of the world, the darkness and suffering that would follow humanity for all time. Pandora's curiosity would lead her to open it, and in doing so, she would release the evils contained within. Disease, sorrow, and death would spill out into the world, and humanity would never be the same. Zeus believed that this would punish Prometheus, punish mankind, and remind them of their place beneath the gods. But as the gods set their plan into motion, they did not understand that Prometheus' rebellion had already set something in motion that they could not control. The fire he had given to humanity had sparked a light that would not be extinguished. No matter how much they tried to punish the mortals, no matter how much they sought to keep them in the dark, the fire would always burn within them. And so, as Pandora opened the box and let loose the horrors that the gods had stored inside, mankind's fate was sealed. But even in the midst of their suffering, even in the pain that followed, there was hope, a small spark left in the bottom of the box, a reminder that the fire Prometheus had given them would never die. It was a gift that could never be taken away, no matter how much the gods tried. There was a sudden hush in the air as Pandora stepped into the world of mortals. It was as if time itself had paused, holding its breath, unsure of what was to come. The very ground seemed to tremble beneath her feet, and the wind whispered her name with a strange, unsettling mix of awe and fear. She was not just a woman, she was a creation, a gift, a curse. Her beauty was like nothing the mortals had ever seen, and it was not simply her face, though it was enough to stop hearts. Her features were perfect, flawless, as if the gods themselves had shaped her from the very essence of desire. Her hair fell in golden waves that shimmered like the sun itself, her eyes sparkled with a strange, captivating light, and when she moved, it was as though the earth itself followed her, bowing to her grace. There was something otherworldly about her, something that made the air crackle around her like static before a storm. The mortals were drawn to her immediately, their gazes fixed upon her with longing and awe. They whispered in hushed tones, unable to comprehend what they were witnessing. She was like a dream, something too beautiful to be real, and yet here she was, standing before them, as if the gods had reached down and placed her in their midst. But with this beauty came a fear that the mortals could not ignore. There was something unsettling about her, something that tugged at their deepest instincts. For all her charm, for all the allure that radiated from her, they could sense that something was not quite right. She was a stranger to them, an unknown. And when the unknown steps into a world so fragile, so full of uncertainty, it is not always met with open arms. There was a tension in the air, a sense of unease that lay just beneath the surface of their adoration. They couldn't help but wonder, what was the price of such beauty? What was the cost of her presence? Among them, one man stood apart, his gaze fixed on Pandora, his heart pounding in his chest. Epimetheus, the brother of Prometheus, had been given the task of welcoming her to the human world. But how could he? How could he understand what this woman represented? He had heard the stories, the whispers of the god's wrath, of the punishment that had been dealt to his brother. But now, standing before Pandora, those stories seemed distant, almost unreal. She was here, and the world was changed. Epimetheus was a simple man, not like his brother Prometheus, whose mind had always been sharp, whose heart had always been driven by a deep, burning purpose. Epimetheus was different. He was kind, gentle, and perhaps, some would say, too trusting. He had never been one to challenge the gods, never been one to question the will of Zeus. When Prometheus had stolen fire for mankind, Epimetheus had been unaware, caught in the simplicity of his own existence. He had never seen the weight of his brother's rebellion, had never felt the consequences of that fateful decision. Now, as he looked at Pandora, he could not help but feel that something was about to change, but he could not yet grasp the full extent of it. He stepped forward, his heart heavy with the burden of his task. There was an unspoken understanding between him and the mortals gathered around. He was to be the one to receive Pandora, to welcome her, to see that she was accepted into the world of men. But as his hands reached out to touch hers, as his eyes met hers for the first time, he felt something stir deep within him, a warning, a whisper of something darker, something more dangerous than he could understand. Pandora smiled, and it was a smile that seemed to promise both warmth and sorrow, joy and pain. She was all at once everything that was beautiful in the world and everything that was terrifying. As her fingers brushed against his, a cold shiver ran down Epimetheus' spine. He couldn't explain it, but there was something about her that made his pulse quicken, something that made his thoughts scatter in 1,000 different directions. He had heard of the box, of course, the one that she carried with her, the one she had been given by the gods themselves. It was a beautiful box, adorned with intricate designs, glimmering with a mysterious light. It was said to contain the very essence of the gods' power, a power that could bring both life and death. Epimetheus had heard the warnings, though they seemed far off, distant. Pandora had been set as a gift, but also as a test, a punishment for the humans, for Prometheus' defiance. What the mortals didn't know, what they could never understand, was that this gift was far more dangerous than any of them could imagine. As he looked into Pandora's eyes, Epimetheus felt the pull of her, the temptation to know her, to understand her. But with that desire came a fear, an instinctive understanding that to truly know her, to truly open himself to her, would mean crossing a line that should never be crossed. She was not just a woman, not just a beautiful creation from the gods. She was something far more dangerous, something that could break the world if she was allowed to. And yet, he couldn't resist. The mortals around them watched, their eyes filled with a mixture of wonder and fear. They had heard the stories of the gods, of the great powers that ruled over them, but now, they were faced with something they could not fully comprehend. Pandora was both their salvation and their doom, the first woman who had ever walked among them. She was a gift, yes, but she was also the beginning of something far darker. Epimetheus stood there, his hands trembling slightly as he held Pandora's gaze. His heart was racing, not just with desire, but with the knowledge that he was now standing on the precipice of something that could never be undone. Pandora's beauty, her charm, was undeniable, but so was the feeling that came with it, the deep, unsettling sense that they were all about to make a choice they couldn't take back. The first impression of Pandora was one of both awe and fear, a mixture of light and darkness that the mortals could not escape. In her, they saw something that both drew them in and warned them to stay away. She was a symbol of everything they desired, but also everything they should have feared. And as Epimetheus took her hand, as he welcomed her into the world of mortals, he could not shake the feeling that something terrible was about to unfold, something that no one, neither gods nor mortals, could control. The night before the marriage, the sky was unusually still. There was no wind, no rustling of trees. The stars above seemed too bright, as though they were watching, waiting. In the quiet of the world, the whispers of fate could almost be heard, those ancient threads weaving themselves tighter, drawing two people together. Yet, what a strange pairing it was. Epimetheus had heard the warnings. His brother, Prometheus, had begged him not to do it. He had warned him about Pandora, about the gods' true intentions, about the box that would follow her, the one that held within it all the horrors of the world. But despite the warnings, despite the ache in his heart, Epimetheus could not bring himself to turn away from her. Pandora had become everything to him. She was a breath of life in a world that had seemed so dark, so cold. When she had first stepped into his world, his heart had been filled with awe, with wonder. He had never seen anything so beautiful. Her golden hair, her shining eyes, the way she moved with such grace, it was impossible not to be drawn to her. He had fallen in love with her the moment she had touched his hand, and in that moment, the world had shifted. She had become his world. But love, Epimetheus had learned, was never simple. His brother had warned him, though the words now felt like distant echoes that he could barely grasp. There was something about Pandora, something about the way she smiled that both enchanted and unnerved him. There were days when he would catch her staring at the box that the gods had given her, her fingers tracing its surface as if it held secrets she longed to unlock. She would look at him then, and her eyes would be full of mystery, of things unsaid, and he would feel a shiver run through him. Still, when he had taken her as his bride, there had been a thrill, a spark of hope. This was love. This was what it meant to be alive. He could not look away from her. She had captivated him, and so he had given her his heart, even though, deep down, he knew that it was not entirely his to give. There was something about her, something that came from a place higher than love, something that went beyond the mortal realm. She had been sent to him, and with her, she had brought something that neither he nor anyone could ever fully understand. The day of the marriage came, and the earth seemed to shift beneath his feet. It was as if all of creation held its breath as they stood together, their hands intertwined. She was his, and he was hers. A simple union, yet there was so much more to it. It was the joining of opposites, the light and the dark, the joy and the sorrow, the gift and the curse. Pandora stood before him, her eyes full of that same unspoken mystery. She wore a gown of shimmering silk, and the light seemed to gather around her as if she was a part of the very sun itself. The mortals who had gathered to witness the union looked on, their eyes wide, some filled with admiration, others with fear. They could sense it too, the weight of this union, the knowledge that something profound was happening before them. Something that could not be undone. As the ceremony began, Epimetheus could not stop himself from glancing at the box. It sat there, like a shadow, beside Pandora, never far from her. It was as if it were a part of her, as much a symbol of her as her beauty and charm. But with each passing moment, the unease inside him grew. He knew that he was crossing a threshold, stepping into something that was already set in motion, something that could not be turned back. When the ceremony ended and they were alone together, the weight of the world seemed to fall upon him. The room, once filled with light and joy, now felt heavy, suffocating. Pandora smiled at him, her lips curving with the same mysterious charm. She was beautiful, she was perfect, and yet there was a coldness behind her smile, something that made his heart race and his thoughts scatter. The box. It was always the box. Pandora had never fully explained what it was, only that it was something the gods had given her, something she was to keep safe. She had never opened it, never dared to, but her curiosity burned brightly within her. Epimetheus could feel it, could see it in the way her eyes lingered on the box, in the way her hands occasionally brushed against it. There was something in her that seemed restless, as if she was waiting for the moment when she could no longer resist. He tried to ignore it, tried to push the feeling down, but it gnawed at him. He had loved her, had given her everything, but the nagging suspicion would not go away. What would happen if she opened it? What if the world, their world, was not as it seemed? What if this beautiful, perfect woman he had married was not just a blessing, but a harbinger of something darker? The days that followed were a blur of happiness and doubt, joy and fear. Epimetheus had never known such conflicting emotions. When Pandora laughed, when she gazed at him with those bright, loving eyes, he felt a warmth in his chest, a hope that he had never known. But when she stood alone, staring at the box, he could not shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something far beyond their understanding was at work. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Pandora stood before him, her hands resting lightly on the box. Epimetheus had been speaking with the other mortals, but he noticed her absence, and his heart skipped a beat. He turned, his eyes locking onto her figure in the distance. There was something different about her then, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. She was no longer just Pandora, the woman he had married. She was something more, something that carried with it the weight of the gods' will, the weight of fate. Her fingers, trembling ever so slightly, hovered over the box's lid. He rushed forward, his heart pounding. "Pandora," he called, his voice filled with desperation, "don't open it. Please." But she didn't hear him. Or perhaps she did, and it didn't matter. She was drawn to it, just as the gods had known she would be. In that moment, as she opened the box, something terrible stirred inside him. It was as if the world shifted, as if the very ground beneath their feet had split open. The light around them seemed to dim, and a chill settled in the air. He had no time to stop it. The horrors of the world, sickness, death, despair, spilled out from the box in a rush of darkness. And in that moment, as Pandora closed the lid, the weight of what they had just unleashed settled over them both. Epimetheus stared at her, his heart broken. He had loved her, and she had loved him, but love, it seemed, could not protect them from the consequences of their choices. They were bound together now, not just in joy, but in suffering, in the knowledge that what they had created, what they had dared to bring into the world, could never be undone. The day Zeus sent the gift arrived without warning, as if the gods had decided that mortal lives could be shaped by a single, simple act. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a strange, golden glow over the land. It felt like the world was waiting, poised for something that no one could understand. And then, the gift arrived. It wasn't a grand procession, no thunderous roar or loud announcement. It came in silence, as if it had always been meant to be there, waiting patiently for its moment to be received. A box, simple in form, yet strangely heavy in the air around it. It was placed before Pandora and Epimetheus, a small wooden chest, covered in ornate carvings that seemed to shift and change in the light. The designs were intricate, like delicate whispers that beckoned curiosity, like secrets that begged to be uncovered. Pandora stared at it for a long time, her breath catching in her throat. There was something unsettling about it, something that made her heart beat a little faster. Her hands, almost of their own accord, reached out, her fingers brushing against the cool surface. It was smooth, polished, and it pulsed with a strange energy, as if it contained something alive within. The silence between them was thick, heavy. Epimetheus, standing beside her, shifted uncomfortably. He had been told, no, he had warned, that this day would come. Prometheus, his brother, had spoken of it in hushed tones, his words sharp with fear. Pandora, he had said, whatever you do, do not open the box. No matter what. There is danger inside. The gods are never kind with their gifts. But Pandora only heard the faint echo of those words now. They seemed distant, like a whisper lost in a storm. Her attention was fixed solely on the box before her. She could feel its weight, not in her hands, but in her chest, in her very soul. It was calling to her. The temptation was unbearable. She could not look away. You mustn't, Epimetheus said softly, his voice trembling. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, but his touch only made her heart beat faster. She could feel his concern, his love, but it felt like something more, something almost desperate, as if he could see the danger in her eyes, as if he could already sense what was to come. But Pandora's gaze remained fixed, unblinking. Why? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She turned to look at him, and in her eyes was something dark, something that had not been there before. What is inside? Why must I leave it closed? Epimetheus swallowed hard, fighting the lump in his throat. It is a gift from the gods, he said slowly, and they have placed their will within it. We are meant to accept it, not question it. His words hung in the air, but Pandora didn't look convinced. The box was too beautiful, too mysterious. There was something alive in it, something that she could almost taste in the air. It called to her, louder now, almost as if it was reaching for her soul. She leaned closer, her fingers almost brushing the lid again. A chill ran through her, but she could not stop herself. The box was like a puzzle, and she needed to know the answer. She could hear Prometheus' warnings again, faint and far off. But they were too late. The temptation was stronger than her fears, and she could no longer resist. She had to know what the gods had hidden inside. As she lifted the lid, a strange shudder passed through her, a sensation like the world was about to shift. For a moment, the air was still, and then everything changed. A terrible wind howled from the box, swirling around them, and a wave of darkness poured out. It was not just darkness, it was sorrow, regret, pain, everything that had ever been hidden beneath the surface of the world. The earth seemed to tremble, and the sky above darkened, as if the heavens themselves were weeping. Pandora's hand shook, but she could not close it. Her heart pounded in her chest, a drumbeat of terror and guilt. She tried to push the lid down, to stop what was happening, but it was too late. The gift, the curse of the gods, had been released. From the box, the horrors of the world began to slip into existence. Illness, suffering, and despair spread like wildfire, filling the world with an unbearable weight. Every inch of the earth seemed to be soaked in the pain that had been hidden for so long, a deep, consuming sorrow that could not be escaped. People cried out, the land itself groaned beneath the weight of it all. The world felt smaller, darker, and infinitely colder. Pandora gasped, her breath catching in her throat as she realized the gravity of her mistake. But there was no turning back. She had opened the box, and with it, the suffering of the world had been released. She felt the weight of it in her very bones, the sense that everything had changed forever. And yet, through all the despair, through all the pain, there was something else. It was a faint light, barely visible at first, flickering like a dying star. Hope, small and fragile, but it was there. It fluttered weakly within the box, untouched by the horrors that had escaped. It was the one thing that had not been swallowed by the darkness, the one thing that had survived. Pandora reached into the box, her hand trembling, desperate to hold onto that fleeting light. Her fingers brushed against it, and in that moment, she understood. Hope was the final gift. Hope was the one thing the gods had left behind, the only thing that could keep the world from falling completely into ruin. It was fragile, like a tiny flame in the vast dark, but it was enough. As Pandora closed the lid of the box, the world seemed to breathe again, just for a moment. The air lightened, the darkness receded slightly, and the weight in her chest eased. But the damage was done. The horrors had been released, and there was no undoing it. She looked at Epimetheus, her eyes filled with the horror of what she had just done, and yet, a glimmer of hope still remained, flickering in her heart. "What have I done?" she whispered, her voice thick with fear and sorrow. Epimetheus could only shake his head, his face pale. His hands trembled as he reached for her, pulling her close. He did not have the answers. He could not take away the suffering, nor could he change the course of what had just happened. But together, they would face it, as they had faced everything else. Together, they would carry the weight of the god's gift and its curse. In that moment, the box, though sealed, was no longer just a box. It had become a symbol of all that had been lost and all that could still be saved. It was the embodiment of Pandora herself, both a gift and a curse, beautiful and terrible, carrying within it the darkest shadows and the faintest hope. The box sat there, never far from her gaze. It was impossible to ignore it. Even when the days stretched long and quiet, its presence seemed to weigh on the air, like a shadow clinging to the edges of her thoughts. Pandora couldn't escape it, even when she tried to turn her mind to other things. It was always there, waiting, just out of reach. Her curiosity gnawed at her like a persistent hunger. It wasn't just the box. It was the unknown, the promise of something hidden. She had spent days trying to forget it, trying to push the questions from her mind, but with every passing hour, the need to know grew stronger. It was as if the box was calling her, whispering secrets that only she could hear. It was a pull that was impossible to explain, a force beyond her control. Pandora found herself pacing the small room they called home, the walls closing in as her mind raced. How could something so simple, so ordinary, hold such a powerful hold over her? It was just a box. Just a gift. A curse, maybe, but a gift all the same. Yet, every time her eyes flickered to the sealed lid, her heart quickened, and a question she couldn't answer bubbled to the surface. What was inside? What would happen if she just opened it? She tried to distract herself. She talked to Epimetheus, tried to focus on their small, quiet life together. But no matter how much she tried, the box was always there, like a storm just out of reach, building, waiting to break. "Don't," Prometheus' warning echoed in her mind, a constant hum beneath her thoughts. "Do not open the box," his words had been clear, precise. But now they seemed so far away, as if spoken by someone else. Someone who didn't understand what it was like to be human. To feel the hunger for knowledge. Her hands trembled as she reached for the box again, the smooth surface almost inviting her touch. Just one look, she told herself. Asterisk, just one small glance. It won't hurt anyone, asterisk. She recoiled at the thought, her heart hammering in her chest. No, she couldn't do it. The memory of the darkness that had flooded out when she opened it the first time was enough to hold her back. The feeling of the world tilting, of the very earth trembling under the weight of the suffering unleashed. It had felt like an eternity, one single, horrifying moment of exposure to the god's anger. Yet, the temptation didn't fade. It burned brighter with each passing day, each tick of the clock. Curiosity had always been part of her. It was what made her, her. The gods had made her beautiful, wise, full of grace, but they had also given her something else. A mind that questioned. A mind that searched. She was not a simple creation, meant only to live in the shadow of her beauty. She wanted more. She needed more. It was a spark inside her, one she couldn't extinguish, no matter how hard she tried. But with that hunger came a cost. She couldn't ignore the words of Zeus, the command that had come from the highest of all gods. Do not open the box. His voice was like thunder, carrying the weight of something far greater than herself. She was his creation, after all. His gift to mankind. She had been made to fulfill his will. It was why she was here. It was her purpose. Wasn't it? To obey? And yet, the box sat there, whispering to her. With every passing moment, it felt like it was growing louder, urging her to break the seal, to uncover the truth hidden inside. The struggle between her obedience and her nature tore at her. She was trapped in a silent war, her desires pitted against the fears that gripped her heart. She would turn away, focusing on the day-to-day tasks. She would clean, cook, talk with Epimetheus, anything to distract herself from the constant pull of the box. But even in the quiet moments, her thoughts would slip back. What if there was something beautiful inside? What if it was a gift, not a curse? What if it was meant for her? She had already seen the darkness pour out before, but that flicker of hope, so small and fragile, had remained. It was the only thing that hadn't been consumed by the suffering. Hope, a small light in a vast, endless night. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She had to know. She had to understand what that hope meant, what it could offer the world. It was maddening, the way the questions circled in her mind, tightening like a knot that could never be undone. Epimetheus noticed her struggle. She could feel his eyes on her when she looked away from the box, the concern in them making her heart ache. He had been gentle with her, always trying to offer comfort, even when he didn't fully understand the weight she carried. He had been the one to warn her, the one who had tried to shield her from the consequences of her own curiosity. But what if he was wrong? What if she was meant to open it? Every time she saw the concern in his eyes, every time he asked, "Are you all right?" a part of her wanted to break down and tell him the truth, that she was not all right, that she was suffocating beneath the weight of the box. She couldn't bear to carry it alone anymore. She needed to know what lay inside, needed to answer the questions that burned through her. But then the fear would creep back in. The image of the darkness rushing out of the box would flood her mind, and she would pull away. No, she thought. Asterisk, I must stay obedient. I must listen to the gods, asterisk, but even as she said the words, they felt empty, like an old lullaby meant to comfort a frightened child. Her mind raced in circles, emotions battling each other in a frenzy. Was obedience the answer? Could she live with herself, knowing she had followed the gods' will without question? Or was the truth inside the box something she had a right to uncover, something she needed to understand? Pandora could feel the pull growing stronger, like a tide pulling her deeper. Her thoughts scattered, fragments of emotions fighting to rise to the surface. She wanted to obey. She wanted to be good. But the temptation to know, to understand, was overwhelming. The question twisted in her mind again and again, asterisk, what's inside, asterisk. And with it came the haunting realization, the more she tried to resist, the stronger the temptation became. She was caught in the grip of something far greater than herself, and the struggle between obedience and curiosity seemed impossible to win. Would she open it? Would she give in to the pull, or would she live with the uncertainty forever? All she knew was that the box was never far from her thoughts, and with every passing day, the seeds of curiosity grew deeper, twisting and turning, threatening to consume her entirely. The room was unnaturally still, the only sound the faint crackling of a fire in the hearth. Pandora's breath was shallow, her chest tight with a mixture of fear and desire. Her eyes fixed on the box. It seemed different now, as if it were pulsing, alive in its own way, calling out to her in a language she couldn't understand. The temptation was unbearable. Her hands trembled as she reached for it, and for the first time, she didn't pull away. The forbidden weight of it seemed to anchor her, and a strange sense of relief washed over her. She had waited for this moment for so long, fought the urge to open it, to know what lay hidden inside. But now, there was nothing left to do. Her mind screamed at her to stop, but her body moved against it, as if some invisible force was guiding her. The lid slid off with a whisper, and for a brief second, there was silence. Complete, suffocating silence. Then, it began. At first, it was just a soft breeze, no more than a whisper in the air. But soon, it grew. A dark, swirling wind filled the room, thick and heavy. Pandora froze. The air was different now, charged with something far colder than any winter wind. Her skin prickled as shadows stretched across the walls, like dark hands creeping from the corners of the room. The atmosphere shifted as if the very fabric of the world was tearing apart. Then came the whispers. Faint at first, they echoed from the depths of the box, a chorus of voices that she could not understand, but that filled her with a sense of dread. Panic rose in her chest as she tried to close the box, but it was too late. The darkness was already spilling out, faster than she could react. The whispers turned into screams, sharp and filled with agony, echoing in her ears, each word a jagged shard of pain. Pandora stumbled back, her heart pounding as the room seemed to close in around her. The first thing she saw was the disease. It was everywhere, the very air thick with sickness. She watched, helpless, as her hands seemed to wither before her eyes, the skin blotching with dark spots, a fever building under her skin. Her breath grew shallow, and her legs gave way, but the sight around her grew worse. The disease spread across the land like wildfire, infecting everything in its path. People were writhing in pain, collapsing in the streets. Families huddled together, coughing, their bodies weakening, their once vibrant eyes now dull and clouded. The wind carried the stench of death, thick and suffocating. Then came the war. It erupted like a thunderclap in Pandora's mind, images of bloodied fields, screaming warriors, and the clash of swords filling her thoughts. The world outside seemed to shift, once peaceful villages now burned, homes reduced to ashes in an instant. The cries of the wounded, the desperate calls for help, rang in her ears. It was as if every corner of the earth had been torn apart by chaos. Families fighting families. Neighbors turned against one another. Pandora tried to look away, but she couldn't escape the horrors. The world had changed, and all of it was her doing. She had opened the box. She had let the evils of the world out. Her heart shattered with the realization. And then, famine. She saw it with such clarity, it was as if it was happening to her. Fields that had once been lush and green were now barren and dry. The crops withered before her eyes, as though the very earth had been stripped of life. People stumbled through the streets, thin, gaunt, their eyes hollow, searching for anything to eat. But there was nothing. The world had been starved of hope. And Pandora was the one who had caused it. Her knees buckled, and she fell to the ground, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. The air felt thick with despair, as though the very sky was pressing down on her, suffocating her with its cruelty. Every soul in the world had been touched by the evil that had been released. The suffering, the pain, the horror, it was all her fault. She had been warned. She had been told. But her curiosity, her need to understand, had driven her to open the box. The voices continued to wail, now joined by the sound of the wind howling through the cracks of the room. It wasn't just her world that had changed. The entire world had been twisted into something unrecognizable. She could feel it in her bones. Everything had shifted. The air grew colder. She could feel the sting of it deep inside her, the chill spreading to the very core of her being. She wanted to scream, to beg for it to stop, to undo the damage she had done. But the truth was, there was no turning back. The box was open. And with it, the evils of the world were free. But then, in the midst of it all, something flickered. A tiny light, the smallest glimmer of hope. It flickered weakly in the corner of her mind, so faint that she almost missed it. But it was there, a fragile light, struggling against the darkness. Pandora's heart stuttered in her chest as she reached for it, even as the pain around her threatened to swallow her whole. She understood then. There was hope. It hadn't been completely consumed by the darkness. It was still there, hidden, like a secret waiting to be uncovered. And that secret, that small glimmer, was the only thing that could save the world. She had released the evils of the world, yes, but there was still something left. Something that could heal the suffering. The world had changed forever, and Pandora knew that the road ahead would be long and painful. But she also knew that there was something worth fighting for. That tiny spark of hope, though fragile, was the only thing that could make the world whole again. As the darkness pressed in, Pandora clung to that flicker, the last vestige of light in a world now consumed by shadows. The world had become unrecognizable. The once peaceful skies now hung heavy with a dark, oppressive cloud that seemed to choke the very air. The earth, once fertile and bountiful, had turned barren, cracked under the weight of famine and despair. Pandora stood at the edge of it all, her body trembling, her heart breaking with every scream that echoed in the distance. The world was no longer the place it had been just days ago. She had opened the box. She had let the darkness in. The weight of the realization pressed down on her, crushing every part of her being. Pandora had known, on some level, that opening the box would come with consequences. But no part of her had been ready for the full force of the destruction she had unleashed. Each day, more suffering poured into the world like an unstoppable tide. Disease spread with ruthless precision, taking the young, the old, the innocent. People that once laughed together now sat in silence, too weak to even speak, their bodies ravaged by illness. And war had not only begun, it had taken root in the very hearts of men. Once calm lands became battlegrounds, villages that had once been homes were now nothing more than smoldering ruins. Families turned against one another, fighting not just for survival, but for the scraps of hope that seemed to have disappeared. The cries of children, starving, frightened, lost, echoed in Pandora's mind, unrelenting, as if the very earth itself had turned against its people. Everywhere she looked, there was pain, despair, hopelessness. Pandora's hands, once delicate and graceful, now felt foreign to her, stained with the weight of the suffering she had caused. She could feel the tears in her eyes, but no matter how hard she tried to weep, they would not fall. It was as if her own soul had become too heavy for her to cry. Her chest ached with guilt, her heart breaking over and over again with each passing moment. What had she done? She had been told not to open the box. The gods had warned her, and she had ignored them. The voices of those around her, friends, family, had echoed warnings too. But her curiosity, her relentless need to understand, had driven her to that moment. Now, Pandora could not escape the endless tide of regret. She watched as a father clutched his child to his chest, his body shaking from hunger, his eyes clouded with the desperate hope that tomorrow might bring something better, though they both knew it would not. The world had changed, and it was she who had brought this upon them all. The sky grew darker by the hour, as though the heavens themselves had become an unwilling witness to her sin. There was no comfort to be found in the gods. They had watched her as she opened the box, their faces distant, indifferent. Not one of them had lifted a hand to help. Not one of them had offered mercy. They had made her the instrument of their anger, a pawn in their game. And now, in the aftermath, they stood high above it all, unmoved. Zeus, sitting proudly on his throne, knew the consequences of what Pandora had done. but to him, the suffering of humanity was but an echo of his will. He had known what would happen, and it did not matter to him. Prometheus had tried to defy him by giving fire to humans, and this was his punishment. The mortals were his toys, his creations, to be twisted as he saw fit. To the gods, the cries of the mortals were as distant as the stars, mere noises in the grand scheme of their divine reign. Pandora had thought that by opening the box, she could bring an end to the suffering, that she could undo the damage she had caused. But instead, as the darkness spread through the world, a new horror gripped her heart. The evils had taken on a life of their own, spreading far and wide, making everything in their path wither and die. There was no way to reverse it. The world would never be the same again. The tears that had refused to fall now came in a rush. Pandora fell to her knees, her fingers scraping the dirt beneath her as if trying to claw her way back into the past, back to when things had been simple and untouched. But the past was gone. The past was lost, and the world was now a place of suffering, a place of endless nights that would never end. How could she have been so foolish? How could she have believed that the gods, who sat on their thrones, untouchable and perfect, would care for the mortals below? She had opened the box. She had let the suffering in. And now, the weight of that choice pressed upon her soul like an iron shackle, unbreakable, unyielding. And yet, in the pit of her guilt, there was something else. A flicker. A glimmer of a thought that whispered to her from the deepest corners of her mind. It was faint, almost too quiet to hear. But it was there. Hope. Hope, weak and fragile as it was, still clung to the world. Even now, in the darkest hours, it could not be completely extinguished. Perhaps the evils that had been unleashed were not the end of the story. Perhaps there was still a chance for the world to heal. Pandora's eyes lifted, and she gazed at the smoke rising from the horizon, the fires burning brighter than ever. She could not undo the past. The world had been forever changed. But that flicker of hope, that tiny spark, was something worth holding onto. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there could still be something worth fighting for. The world had to fight for it. And so, Pandora, with all the weight of her guilt, rose to her feet. She would carry the burden of her actions, but she would also carry that flicker of hope, small though it may be. And maybe, just maybe, the world would find its way out of the darkness. The ground beneath Epimetheus felt as if it were crumbling, giving way to a world that was no longer his own. He had been at her side when the darkness first descended, and now, standing before her, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were strangers. The connection that had once felt so strong between them, the love they had shared, the promises they had whispered to each other, had frayed and broken. It was not a violent tear, but a slow, suffocating fracture that neither of them could ignore. Pandora was standing in front of him, her hands trembling, her eyes swollen from unshed tears. She looked so much like the woman he had once known. Beautiful, radiant, full of life. But now, there was a weight to her, something invisible but undeniable that seemed to pull at the very core of their existence. The world around them was in ruins, and Pandora, the woman he had chosen to marry, had unleashed it all. "I didn't mean to," Pandora whispered, her voice barely audible, as though the words themselves were too heavy to bear. Epimetheus could see it, the guilt. It writhed in her eyes like a living thing, just as it twisted and churned in his own heart. He wanted to reach out to her, to pull her close and tell her it would be all right, but something in the air between them was too thick. The words that might have once comforted her now seemed hollow. How could he tell her it was not just her fault? That they were both responsible? How could he console her when he, too, felt the crushing weight of their shared sin? Pandora had opened the box, yes, but it was his choice, too. He had watched her struggle, had seen her grow restless with curiosity, and yet he had said nothing. He had stood by her, believed in her, when he should have stopped her. He should have protected her from herself. "I didn't know," Epimetheus muttered. His voice cracked, like glass breaking. "I didn't know you would open it." He stepped back, pain and confusion pulling him in two different directions. His heart screamed to comfort her, but his mind burned with the image of the suffering that now stretched out endlessly before them. The fire still raged in the distance. The smoke reached the heavens, darkening the sky. Every breath felt thick with the stench of death. The earth itself seemed to tremble under the weight of the chaos that had been unleashed. People were dying. Families were torn apart. The world he had once believed in, was unraveling. Pandora flinched as he spoke, her eyes flickering with something, guilt, maybe, but also something darker. I should have listened. I should have been strong enough to resist. Her words hit him harder than any blow. He had always known her to be strong, to carry herself with grace and intelligence. Yet here she was, broken under the weight of her own actions. His heart ached at the sight of her, and yet, there was a part of him that couldn't shake the fury building inside. The anger wasn't directed at her, not entirely. It was at the gods. At Zeus. At everything that had led to this moment. It was at the gods who had manipulated them, played their lives as if they were pawns. At the cruel irony that he, Epimetheus, had been the one to receive the gift of Pandora. He had thought it was a blessing, that she was his prize, his redemption. But instead, she had been a curse, and together they had doomed mankind. I told you, he said through gritted teeth, his voice rising with emotion. I told you not to open it. I warned you, and you didn't listen. Pandora recoiled at the harshness of his words. She didn't deserve this, he knew that. She was not the villain here. She was the victim, too. But still, the weight of everything they had lost was too much to bear in this moment. His words were not his heart speaking. It was the raw pain of knowing they could never go back, of knowing the damage was done. I'm sorry, she whispered again, her voice fragile. It felt like she was apologizing for the entire world, as though she were the only one responsible for what had happened. I never meant for any of this to happen. Neither did I, Epimetheus replied, his voice softening, but his heart still raw. But now we have to face it. Together. Her eyes lifted to meet his, and for a brief moment, he saw the woman he had fallen in love with, the woman who had smiled with hope, who had trusted him, who had promised to stand by his side. She was still there, deep inside, lost beneath the layers of guilt and despair. How could I have been so blind, he whispered to himself, not sure if he meant it for her or for himself. We were supposed to be happy, Pandora. You and I. But now everything's broken. The silence between them grew heavy. The grief, the sorrow, hung in the air, suffocating everything it touched. Pandora's eyes began to fill with tears again, and this time, Epimetheus could not hold back the flood that rose in his chest. The guilt, the pain, the shared responsibility, it was too much for either of them to bear alone. Slowly, with trembling hands, he reached out to her. There was no anger now, just the quiet ache of regret, the understanding that they were in this together. But even as he touched her hand, a part of him felt distant, as if the world between them had grown too wide, too vast to cross. Will we ever be the same? Pandora asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as though she feared the answer. I don't know, Epimetheus said softly, his voice breaking under the weight of her question. But I don't want to lose you. Not like this. She nodded, the tears finally spilling from her eyes. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers cold and fragile in his grasp. They stood there, side by side, in a world that had been torn apart, trying to hold on to the only thing left between them, the love that had once defined them, now tempered by regret, sorrow, and the unspoken understanding that their lives would never be the same again. The road ahead was uncertain, but they would walk it together, forever changed. The air was thick with despair. It clung to the land like a heavy mist, suffocating the very life from the earth. Famine, disease, war, all the evils that had been unleashed had spread like wildfire, consuming everything in their path. The people suffered, their cries echoing in the distance, blending with the winds of misery. There was no escape, no refuge. Pandora stood amidst it all, her heart aching, her mind consumed by the enormity of the mistake she had made. Her gaze was fixed on the box, the vessel of her ruin. It sat on the ground, its wooden surface scarred by her trembling hands. It had been her undoing, the source of the world's torment. It was a curse, a symbol of her weakness. She had opened it, despite all the warnings, despite the weight of her responsibility. And in doing so, she had unleashed the darkness that now surrounded them. But as her eyes traced the edges of the box, something caught her attention, something faint, something almost too delicate to notice. A small glow flickered inside, soft and fragile, like a distant star in a pitch-black sky. It was a light, not of fire, but of something purer, something gentle. Hope. Pandora's breath caught in her throat as she took a step closer. Her heart, heavy with guilt and despair, fluttered uncertainly. It felt impossible that anything good could remain after everything she had set in motion. Yet there it was, a tiny, almost imperceptible light, shining from within the darkness. Hope. The word echoed in her mind, pulling her closer to the box. Her hands, still trembling, reached for it, her fingers brushing against the wood. It had felt so final when she had opened it, the weight of her decision, the irreversible nature of what she had done. But now, this small, fragile light seemed to suggest something else, something different. It was as though it was calling to her, offering her a way back from the edge, a path to redemption. How could there be hope, she wondered, when so much suffering had already been unleashed? How could anything be salvaged from the chaos she had caused? But the light did not fade. It remained, flickering softly, as if it were waiting, patiently, for her to understand. She sank to her knees before the box, staring into the soft glow. She thought of the people, their faces twisted in pain and fear. She thought of the homes reduced to ash, the families torn apart, the children crying in hunger. Was it too late for them? Was it too late for the world? And yet, the light persisted. Her heart, which had been heavy with guilt, began to stir, a flicker of warmth rising in her chest. The weight of the box, the weight of her actions, felt lighter somehow, as though the light inside the box was offering her something she had not dared to hope for, redemption. The possibility that there could still be something good in the world, that despite everything, something pure had been left behind. Pandora's mind raced, torn between the memory of her mistake and the fragile spark that now seemed to promise a chance at something better. She had opened the box, yes. But that did not mean the world had to remain in darkness forever. Perhaps this was a chance to make amends, to undo some of the damage. It would not be easy. It could never be easy. But there was something about that faint light, something about the way it refused to fade, that made her believe, just for a moment, that it was possible. Hope. She repeated the word to herself, as if it were a prayer. It was fragile, yes. But it was real. The gods had used her. They had sent her as a punishment, a tool to bring suffering to mankind. But in the midst of that punishment, there was something they could not have foreseen. There was a light, a glimmer of hope that even they could not snuff out. And though Pandora had unleashed the evils of the world, she had also been the one to carry this last, precious gift. Her thoughts turned to Epimetheus. The pain in his eyes, the sorrow that mirrored her own. She had seen the way he looked at her, the way the guilt weighed on him, too. They had both been responsible, in different ways, for the suffering that had spread across the world. But now, as she sat there before the box, she realized that perhaps there was still a way forward. Not for herself alone, but for both of them. For the world. She rose slowly, her fingers still lingering on the box, the light pulsing gently beneath her touch. She could not undo what had been done. The evils would not simply vanish. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way to fight against them. There was a way to give the people something to hold on to. Something to believe in, even in the darkest of times. The light seemed to grow brighter, as if responding to her resolve, and Pandora knew, in that moment, that she had been given a second chance. Not to erase her past, but to shape a future where, despite all the darkness, hope could still find a place. For the first time since opening the box, Pandora smiled, a small, tentative smile, but a smile nonetheless. It was a smile filled with the promise of something more, something beyond the pain, beyond the ruin. It was a smile that held the quiet certainty that no matter how much darkness there was in the world, hope could still bloom. And if she could help nurture it, even in the smallest of ways, then perhaps all was not lost after all. Hope. It was enough. It was everything. And it was hers to protect. The world had not changed. Not truly. The pain was still there, suffocating every corner, every living soul. The skies were thick with sorrow, the land barren, stripped of its life by the darkness Pandora had unleashed. Disease ran rampant, hunger gnawed at every body, and war had torn apart any remaining hope for peace. Yet, amidst all of this suffering, something subtle was beginning to shift. It was so small at first, so quiet, that it could easily have been ignored. But it was there, rising like the first light of dawn, ever so gently pushing back the darkness. It began in whispers, and acts so simple they seemed insignificant. A child, smiling through the pain, offering the last bit of bread to a hungry sibling. An old woman, cradling a wounded man in her arms, whispering words of comfort, even though her own body trembled with exhaustion. The mother, whose face had once been hollow with despair, now finding the strength to cradle her newborn, despite the destruction around her. These acts of kindness were like fragile threads, weaving through the tattered fabric of a broken world. Pandora watched it all, from the edge of the forest where she had taken refuge, unable to escape the memories that gnawed at her. The guilt, thick as smoke, clouded her every thought. She had opened the box, and in doing so, she had let the horrors loose. The pain she saw in the faces of the people, the suffering she could not erase, it was all her fault. And yet, she could not help but notice something shifting within herself. There was a light inside her, one that had not been there before, and it was slowly starting to grow. The light was not hers, not really. It was something greater, something that had been inside the box all along, something that even the gods had not foreseen. Hope. It came quietly at first, like a whisper in the wind. She could feel it in the way the people began to help each other, the way they began to find small moments of peace in the chaos. She could feel it in herself too, as the weight of her actions began to lighten, just a little, with every small act of kindness she witnessed. It was in the way a woman offered her last drop of water to a dying man, knowing it might cost her life, but doing it anyway. It was in the way a man, who had lost everything, took in a stranger who had lost even more. It was in the way they began to rebuild, not with grand gestures, but with small steps, feeding the hungry, tending to the sick, giving shelter to the homeless. They were not saving the world, not by any measure, but they were offering something far more important, hope. A glimmer of light in the darkest of times. Pandora stood in the shadows, watching it all unfold, and for the first time since she opened the box, she felt a flicker of something other than guilt. It was not enough to erase what she had done, but it was something. It was proof that even in the midst of suffering, the human spirit could endure. That love, compassion, and kindness were not extinguished by darkness. Instead, they were the threads that held the world together. But there was still so much to be done. Pandora knew that. The evil had been released, and it would not be easily undone. There was no quick fix, no way to return the world to what it once was. She had caused the storm, and now she had to find a way to weather it, to help others weather it too. Her heart still ached for what had been lost, for the pain she could never undo. But hope was something she could give. She could help, not by undoing the past, but by helping to build a future. It would not be easy. It would take everything she had, but she could see now, more clearly than ever, that hope was a force far greater than evil. It was a force that could heal, that could mend even the most broken of hearts. Pandora walked among the people, quietly, humbly. She no longer held her head high with the pride of a goddess, nor did she hide in shame. She was simply another person, just as broken and just as hopeful as the ones around her. She spoke to them, not with words of grand wisdom, but with simple acts of kindness. She fed the hungry, she tended to the sick, and she gave comfort to the grieving. And slowly, in the smallest ways, she began to see the change. A child smiled, even though their parents had perished. A man found the strength to continue, even though he had lost everything. A community, once torn apart by fear, began to rebuild together. It was not a grand transformation, not a sudden miracle. But it was enough. It was enough to show Pandora that hope had power, more power than she had ever imagined. The gods had given her a curse, but in their cruelty, they had unknowingly gifted the world with something far greater. Hope. The very thing that could mend what had been broken. The very thing that could heal the wounds, one small act at a time. Pandora knew her guilt would never fully vanish. She would always carry the burden of her actions, of the chaos she had caused. But as she watched the world around her begin to heal, she realized that maybe, just maybe, redemption was not about erasing the past. It was about finding the strength to rise again, to build something better from the ruins. It was about hope. And as the days passed, that light, small, fragile, but ever-present, grew stronger. It was not a blinding light that overwhelmed the darkness, but a quiet, steady light that slowly, steadily, found its way into every corner of the world. And Pandora, as she walked among the people, began to understand. Hope was not just a gift. It was the very thing that gave the world the strength to keep going, even when everything seemed lost. In the end, it was not her actions alone that could heal the world. It was the resilience of the human spirit, the willingness to endure, to fight for each other, even when the world seemed beyond saving. And in the midst of it all, hope remained, a beacon in the darkness, guiding them forward. The cries of the world echoed through the wind, a constant, unrelenting sound that tore at the very fabric of the earth. Disease spread like wildfire, creeping through villages, cities, and towns. Mothers wept over sick children, their small bodies growing weaker by the day. War ravaged entire kingdoms, families torn apart by endless conflict, as leaders stoked the flames of hatred. And despair, it clung to the hearts of every mortal, wrapping them in a cold, suffocating embrace. The world had become a place of shadows, of broken dreams, where the light seemed as though it could never return. Yet, even in the deepest pit of suffering, something began to stir. Something small, almost invisible, but undeniable. Hope. It flickered like a candle in the wind, fragile but steady. And as much as the darkness sought to swallow it whole, hope refused to be extinguished. In the midst of the chaos, two souls, seemingly ordinary, but in their own way extraordinary, stood as symbols of the eternal struggle between evil and hope. One was a young woman named Lysandra, who had witnessed the brutal ravages of war take everything from her. Her family was gone, her village burned to the ground, but still, she carried on. She walked through the ruins of her home, picking up the pieces of a shattered life, even when there seemed to be nothing left. Her heart was heavy with loss, yet her steps were steady, her eyes searching the horizon as though there was something more beyond the devastation. She had no power, no weapons, no magic to stop the war that had swept across her land. She could not fight the sickness that had taken so many lives. But she could do something small, something that no one else had the strength to do. She could offer a hand to those who had fallen, she could care for the wounded, she could give food to the hungry. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was her way of defying the darkness that sought to consume them all. Her face was lined with the exhaustion of countless sleepless nights spent tending to the sick, but her eyes still shone with a quiet defiance. She didn't know how she could stop the war, or how she could heal the land, but she knew that as long as she had breath in her body, she would continue to fight, for the people who had nothing left, for those who had been forgotten by the gods. Lysandra had no illusions that she could turn the tide, but her acts of kindness were small beacons of light in a world suffocating under the weight of despair. Then there was Darius. A soldier, hardened by the bloodshed he had witnessed, his armor battered and stained. He had fought in countless battles, but nothing had prepared him for the horrors that Pandora's curse had unleashed upon the world. His comrades had fallen, one by one, the chaos of war swallowing them whole. His own heart had turned cold with the brutality of the world, and yet, in his darkest moments, something still flickered within him. The spark of hope, no matter how faint it seemed, kept him moving forward. Darius was no stranger to pain, but he could not bear to see the suffering of those around him, those who had no power to defend themselves. He had seen the toll war had taken on the innocent. The children who had been orphaned, the mothers who had been forced to watch their homes burn. The lives lost for nothing, it seemed, except for the twisted desires of men. But even amidst this cruelty, Darius could still feel the pull of something greater, a quiet call to do what he could, even if it was only to save one life, even if it was only to show one person that there was still hope in the world. Lysandra and Darius, two souls caught in the same storm, walking different paths, but driven by the same force. Hope. It wasn't something grand. It wasn't something that could easily be seen or touched. It was in the small, everyday things, in a kind word, in the hand extended to someone in need, in the determination to keep going even when the world seemed to be crumbling around them. Yet, as the days passed, they saw how hope, no matter how small, began to spread. Like a virus, it infected the hearts of the people. In the face of unimaginable suffering, people still found the strength to endure. Families helped each other, even when they had nothing left to give. Strangers came together to rebuild what had been destroyed. Villages, once decimated by war, began to rebuild their homes from the rubble. The world wasn't saved, not by a long shot, but hope, it had not been snuffed out. It had only been buried, waiting to rise again. But the darkness still loomed. Disease, war, and despair continued to dominate the lives of mortals, and it was impossible to ignore the weight of it all. The impact of Pandora's act stretched far beyond the boundaries of any one kingdom. It had poisoned the very air they breathed. It had tainted everything. People cried out to the gods for mercy, but none came. The world felt abandoned, left to fend for itself in the wake of a curse that had no end. And yet, there was still that flickering light, that glimmer of defiance in the faces of those like Lysandra and Darius. They were not alone, though they often felt as if they were. Others shared their struggle, others who had not given in to despair. It was in the quiet moments when they crossed paths, when they shared stories of survival, when they looked into each other's eyes and saw the same weariness, the same hope, that they understood. They were all in this together. The world was broken, the gods indifferent, but as long as there was even one person willing to stand up, to fight, to give, hope could not be destroyed. The days dragged on, each one darker than the last, but the flicker of light refused to go out. And in the hearts of mortals everywhere, the battle between evil and hope raged on. The world might be in chaos, but as long as hope remained, even in the smallest of ways, there was still a chance for a tomorrow that might be just a little bit brighter than the day before. Lysandra and Darius would keep fighting, and so would the others. Because, in the end, it was not the gods who would save them. It was the strength of the human spirit, and the hope that even in the darkest of times, there was still a way forward. The sky darkened, as though the heavens themselves were boiling with rage. A storm was coming, the kind that would shake the world to its core. Thunder rumbled like an angry beast, and the winds howled as if they carried the fury of gods. Pandora, standing at the edge of her world, could feel it in her bones. She had done it. She had opened the box, and unleashed more suffering upon the earth than any mortal had ever known. She had hoped that somewhere, hidden among the horrors, there might be a sliver of salvation. But that hope had been dimmed by the sheer weight of the evil she had released. And now, as if the world itself had been cursed, the heavens turned their wrath upon humanity. The gods were not blind to what had transpired. And Zeus, mighty Zeus, who ruled the skies with an iron fist, was furious. Pandora knew the consequences of her actions, but nothing could have prepared her for what was coming. Her heart raced in her chest as she felt the anger of the gods rising like a tide that could not be held back. She had heard of their vengeance before, their punishments that left entire civilizations trembling in fear. She had heard the stories of those who had dared defy the will of the gods, only to be crushed beneath the weight of divine retribution. The ground beneath her seemed to tremble, and she looked up, her heart heavy with the knowledge that the storm was not only coming for the mortals, but for her, too. There was no escaping the wrath of Zeus. She had not meant to cause this. She had not meant to bring this terrible chaos upon the world. But it did not matter. In the eyes of Zeus, her actions were a direct challenge to his authority, a violation of the cosmic balance. And in the world of the gods, balance was everything. As the thunder crashed overhead, Pandora's thoughts were interrupted by a voice, a booming sound that seemed to come from all directions at once, reverberating in her very soul. Pandora, it called, and the name echoed in her mind like a death knell. What have you done? She flinched, not daring to answer, but she knew there was no escaping the judgment that was coming. Zeus was a god of justice, and his wrath would not be stayed. His anger was not born out of malice, but out of a sense of balance. He believed that the world, the cosmos itself, must be kept in order. And Pandora's act had thrown it all into chaos. The mortals were suffering. Disease, war, famine, their lives were crushed beneath the weight of Pandora's curiosity, and the gods, in their perfect and distant world, watched on with indifferent eyes. It was an unnatural imbalance, and Zeus would not let it stand. Pandora had thought she was acting out of compassion, but the cost of her actions was far greater than she could have ever imagined. She had released suffering, and in doing so, she had upset the delicate harmony of the world. And now, she would face the punishment she knew was coming. The heavens raged with fury as Zeus prepared to make his decree. His anger was not just for Pandora's mistake, but for the ripples it had sent through the mortal realm, disturbing the balance that kept everything in order. It was not only Pandora who would pay for her disobedience. All of humanity would bear the brunt of Zeus's wrath. In the distance, there were flashes of lightning, bright enough to blind. Each strike of lightning was a reminder that the gods were watching, and they were judging. Pandora's guilt weighed heavily upon her, but she could not escape the consequences of her actions. She had opened the box, and the evils had been set free. There was no undoing it now. Zeus's voice rang out again, this time with more power, shaking the earth beneath Pandora's feet. You, Pandora, have upset the very fabric of life. The suffering you have unleashed cannot go unpunished. You have brought chaos into a world that was once orderly. For this, I will not show mercy. Pandora felt the weight of those words press down on her. There would be no mercy, no forgiveness. She had acted out of curiosity, out of a desire to understand, but now she saw the true cost of her actions. It was as if the storm itself was punishing her, a reflection of the pain she had caused. Zeus's anger could not be contained, and with each word, the storm grew more violent. The winds howled and the skies flashed with lightning, each bolt a reminder of the divine power that Zeus wielded. The gods had no tolerance for rebellion, and Pandora had defied them in the most disastrous way imaginable. As Zeus's wrath descended upon the earth, the consequences were immediate and dire. The mortals, already suffering from the evils Pandora had unleashed, found their lives growing even harder. Hunger, disease, and war intensified. The suffering was compounded by the wrath of the gods. The balance of the world had been shattered, and now the gods themselves sought to restore it, by whatever means necessary. Pandora could do nothing but watch as her mistake unfolded before her. She had thought that hope might be her redemption, that maybe there was still a chance for peace in the world. But Zeus had no intention of letting that happen. His sense of justice was absolute, and in his eyes, Pandora's act had been a betrayal of the cosmic order. The gods had set their punishment in motion, and there was no escaping it. Pandora's heart ached with the weight of her guilt, but it was nothing compared to the immense, overwhelming power of Zeus's wrath. It was a force beyond her comprehension, a force that would take everything from her and the mortals she had once hoped to save. The winds howled louder, and the storm intensified, as if the very world itself was crying out in agony. It was the wrath of Zeus, and it would not be silenced. Pandora's heart pounded in her chest as she faced the consequences of her actions, knowing that there was no way to undo the damage she had caused. And in that moment, as the storm raged around her, she understood what it truly meant to face the wrath of a god. The world had not stopped spinning, but for Pandora, time felt as if it had come to a standstill. Every day was like an echo of the past, a cruel reminder of the evils she had set loose upon the world. The weight of her guilt pressed down on her like a stone, unyielding, suffocating. Even though she had seen hope flicker in the depths of the box, it felt distant now, like a star lost in a storm. How could she find redemption? How could she undo what she had done? Her footsteps were heavy as she walked through the dense, dark forest, the trees standing tall like silent witnesses to her misery. Every leaf that rustled in the wind seemed to whisper her name, reminding her of the consequences of her actions. The world around her was a reflection of her inner turmoil, chaos, and despair, with brief moments of clarity. She had been lost for so long, drowning in the regret that had come from her curiosity, from her need to understand something beyond her reach. Pandora had never meant for it to be this way. She had only wanted to help, to find a way to bring light to the world. But all she had brought was darkness. The world was suffering, and she was the cause. But now, there was a flicker inside her. A spark of something more than guilt. A tiny seed of hope. She had realized, through the years of torment and reflection, that while she could never undo what she had done, there was something she could do. There had to be a way. A way to find peace. A way to make up for her mistake. The path she had set herself upon was not easy. Redemption was a word that felt foreign to her, like a language she couldn't quite understand. But she had to try. She had to do something. And so, she set out to seek the wisdom of those who had seen more of the world than she had. The gods, though distant and often indifferent, might still have something to offer her. The first figure she sought was Athena, the goddess of wisdom. She had heard that the wise goddess understood the hearts of mortals and gods alike. When Pandora arrived at Athena's temple, it was as if she had stepped into another world. The air was thick with a kind of quiet power. The walls were lined with ancient scrolls, and the very stones beneath her feet seemed to hum with knowledge. Pandora hesitated before approaching the goddess. How could she, the one who had caused so much pain, dare to seek guidance from someone like Athena? But as soon as she entered the chamber, Athena's gaze fell upon her, sharp and knowing. The goddess spoke, her voice like a soft wind. You seek redemption, Pandora. But do you understand what that means? Pandora nodded, though doubt gnawed at her. I don't know if I can fix what I've done. But I have to try. I can't live with this guilt. I have to find a way to make it right. Athena studied her for a long moment. Redemption is not a simple path. You cannot undo the past. It's gone, and it has shaped the world in ways you cannot reverse. But there is something you can do, something only you can give. True redemption lies not in erasing the past, but in the way you move forward. In the choices you make. In your willingness to change and learn. Pandora's heart beat faster as Athena's words sank in. There was no undoing the box, no turning back the hands of time. But perhaps, just perhaps, she could find peace by helping others, by showing them the same grace she had denied herself. With a renewed sense of purpose, Pandora left Athena's temple and sought out other figures, gods and wise mortals alike. Each encounter was a lesson, each conversation a revelation. Some told her to accept what she had done, to face her guilt head-on. Others spoke of forgiveness, of how even the gods themselves sometimes needed to find the strength to forgive themselves. But it was the words of a humble mortal that changed Pandora the most. She had wandered into a small village, where people still lived with the consequences of the evils she had unleashed. The faces of the villagers were etched with sorrow and struggle, their lives shaped by hunger, disease, and war. Pandora felt the weight of it all. One woman, older than most, sat by the edge of a fire, her hands worn from years of labor. She looked at Pandora with eyes full of wisdom, as if she had seen all the horrors of the world and still found a way to endure. I know what you've done, the woman said softly. But you're here, aren't you? You're still trying. That's something. A long time ago, I lost my daughter to a plague. The gods didn't care. But I kept going. For the ones who were still here. For the ones who needed me. We can't change the past, but we can make tomorrow a little brighter. One small act of kindness, one small step toward healing, can make all the difference. Pandora's heart swelled. Here, in the midst of suffering, there was a glimmer of something more. Hope, fragile and fleeting, yet real. The woman's words were a balm to Pandora's soul. She couldn't change the past, but she could change her future. She could offer something to the world. She could help heal what she had broken. And so, Pandora began her work. She traveled from village to village, helping where she could, offering guidance and compassion. She became a beacon of hope for those who had lost everything. She tended to the sick, comforted the grieving, and helped rebuild the communities that had been torn apart by the evil she had released. It was not enough to erase the suffering, but it was enough to show that even in the darkest of times, the smallest light could push back the shadows. With each step she took, Pandora felt a weight lifting from her heart. She was not undoing the harm she had done, but she was learning to live with it. She was learning that redemption was not a destination, but a journey, one that required humility, sacrifice, and the willingness to change. She would never be able to undo the horrors of the past, but she could create a future filled with acts of kindness and understanding. It was a small but significant step. A step toward forgiveness, not just from others, but from herself. And in that quiet, powerful moment, Pandora realized that the path to redemption was not about perfection. It was about finding peace, one small act at a time. Pandora stood at the edge of a cliff, looking out over a world she had broken and tried to heal. The wind howled in her ears, its cold bite like a reminder that she could never escape the weight of her actions. But as her gaze swept over the landscape, the same land that had been torn apart by the evil she had unleashed, she saw something different. There were patches of green where hope had begun to grow. The scars of disease, war, and famine were still visible, but they were not the only things in view anymore. The struggle, however, had become her own. Guilt still gnawed at her, pulling at her insides with a relentless hunger. She could feel the heaviness of it, the deep ache that threatened to swallow her whole. Yet, as much as she had tried, as much as she had given to make the world better, there was a creeping sense that something was missing. Something fundamental, something deeper. Pandora clenched her fists, staring down at the soil beneath her feet. Was she truly the cause of all this suffering? Was she the only one to blame? The weight of her guilt was suffocating, but she couldn't help but wonder, was it possible that the evil she had unleashed wasn't entirely her fault? Was there more to the story? Her thoughts swirled like a storm in her mind, each question leading to another. Her heart ached as she remembered the face of the wise woman in the village, the one who had spoken of kindness in the face of pain. Pandora had clung to that small piece of light, but now she wondered if there was more to learn. More to understand. The wind shifted, and she turned, her hair whipping around her face. Her eyes locked onto the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set. The red and orange colors of the sky painted a picture of both beauty and despair. The world had always existed in this delicate balance, light and darkness, joy and sorrow, good and evil. It was in the sky, in the earth, and in the hearts of every mortal who walked upon it. And she, Pandora, had somehow forgotten that. She had thought of herself as the sole source of the world's suffering. She had thought that if she could just erase the mistakes she had made, the evil she had released, everything would be fine. But the more she thought, the more she began to see the truth. Evil had always been a part of the world. It wasn't something she had created. It wasn't something that had come solely from her actions. It was part of existence itself. The presence of evil wasn't just a punishment, it was a part of the very fabric of life. Without darkness, there could be no light. Without struggle, there could be no triumph. Pandora's mistake had been thinking that she alone could fix everything. The truth was, she couldn't. No one could. The evil that had spread across the land, disease, famine, war, was not just her burden to bear. It was part of the universal struggle. Every person, every soul, carried their own battles. They each had their own share of sorrow and joy, good and bad. The balance was fragile, but it was never meant to be perfect. It was the nature of existence to be torn between light and shadow, between love and loss. Pandora closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. For the first time, she felt something shift inside her. The weight of her guilt was still there, but it no longer crushed her with the same intensity. She understood now that her actions had consequences, yes, but they were not the only cause of the world's suffering. There was something larger at play, a universal struggle between good and evil that every person faced. Her mind drifted back to the villagers she had helped, to the moments of kindness and connection she had witnessed. Despite the darkness that had taken root in their lives, there had always been a glimmer of hope. Even in the most dire of circumstances, there had been a choice. A choice to stand up, to keep going, to find the light amidst the darkness. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but it was real. And in that realness, Pandora saw the true nature of existence. The balance wasn't something to be fixed. It wasn't something that could be controlled. It was something to be accepted, to live with, to understand that pain and joy, sorrow and happiness were two sides of the same coin. No one could escape the struggle. It was not a punishment. It was simply life. Pandora felt a rush of understanding flood through her. The guilt that had consumed her for so long began to dissipate, replaced by something else, something powerful and freeing. It wasn't about redemption in the way she had first thought. It wasn't about erasing her mistakes or somehow fixing everything. It was about learning to live with the consequences, accepting the duality of existence, and finding peace within it. The world was still a place of suffering, but it was also a place of beauty, of love, of connection. And it was that connection, those moments of light in the darkness, that made it worth living. It wasn't about escaping the evil, it was about facing it with courage and resilience. It was about knowing that no matter how much darkness there was in the world, there would always be something that pushed back against it, a single act of kindness, a smile shared between strangers, the strength to keep going when all seemed lost. Pandora looked up at the sky again, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the land. The night would come, bringing its own challenges. But with the night came the promise of dawn, of a new day. The balance of life would continue, the duality of existence would remain. And Pandora would continue to play her part, not as a savior, but as a humble participant in the great, eternal struggle between light and darkness. She turned from the cliff, her footsteps sure as she made her way down the path. The road ahead would not be easy, but she understood now that she didn't have to bear the weight of the world alone. The struggle for balance was universal, and it was something every soul would face. But in that struggle, there was strength. There was hope. And that, at last, was enough. Pandora was sitting alone in the quiet after the storm. The world around her was still and heavy, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on her shoulders like 1,000 unspoken words. She had tried to make peace with the chaos, tried to find some sense in the turmoil that had spread across the earth, but the more she thought about it, the more everything seemed out of her control. How could she possibly make things right when the wrongs were so vast, so deep? Could there ever be any redemption, or had she sealed the fate of humanity forever? As her mind swirled in these dark thoughts, a familiar presence disturbed the silence. She looked up, startled, as a figure appeared from the shadows, his form tall and unmistakable. It was Prometheus. Pandora's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't seen him in what felt like an eternity, since the moment he had been bound and cast away for his defiance. And now, here he was, standing before her with eyes that gleamed not with anger, but with something deeper, something that spoke of years of suffering, and wisdom that only time and sacrifice could bring. Prometheus was free. For a moment, there was silence between them. The air felt thick with unspoken words. He didn't look the same as he had before, his eyes held the weight of his punishment, the harshness of the eternity he had endured. But there was a calm about him now, a quiet understanding that made Pandora feel small in comparison. She wasn't sure what to say. She wasn't sure if she even had the right to speak after everything that had happened. "You've been waiting for me," Prometheus said quietly, breaking the stillness. Pandora's breath caught. "I didn't know if I ever would see you again," she admitted, her voice trembling. Prometheus gave a soft, almost sad smile. "I didn't expect to be here either, but nothing is ever as it seems, is it?" He stepped closer, his gaze softening as it met hers. "I see the weight you carry, Pandora. the guilt, the despair. But you must understand something. This world, the suffering, the pain, it's not something that can be undone. It never could have been. Pandora's chest tightened at his words. I thought I could fix it, Prometheus. I thought, if I could just put things right, the world would be healed. He shook his head slowly. That's where you're wrong. You've always been focused on fixing the problem, making it perfect. But the world isn't meant to be perfect. Life is built on the balance of light and dark. Without the suffering, there can be no growth. Without the pain, there can be no strength. The suffering of mankind is not a punishment, Pandora, it's part of their journey. Pandora swallowed hard, trying to make sense of his words. But the evils I've unleashed, they're unbearable. How can people keep going when everything seems so hopeless? Prometheus' gaze softened, his voice gentle yet firm. You see, that's the thing. You look at it from the perspective of one who has been hurt. You see the darkness, the pain, the loss. But you must also see the hope, the light that always follows the darkness. Without the darkness, you can never fully understand the light. Without the struggle, there can be no resilience. Humanity must fight, must struggle, to rise above what weighs them down. Pandora was silent, his words sinking into her like stones in still water. She had always viewed the suffering as something she needed to fix, something that needed to be eliminated. But Prometheus was telling her something entirely different, something she had never considered before. The struggle itself, the constant fight against the odds, was what made life meaningful. He continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone. The world will always have its share of pain. It's the nature of existence. But it is through the pain that people will find their strength, their purpose. My rebellion, the gift of fire to mankind, it was never about creating a world without suffering. It was about showing them that even in the deepest despair, there is a way forward. They will rise, they will stumble, but they will never stop. And in that, there is hope. Pandora felt a wave of emotion surge through her. She had been so focused on her own guilt, her own failure, that she hadn't seen the bigger picture. She hadn't understood that the world's suffering wasn't just her burden. It was part of everyone's journey. And through it all, there was hope, a light that could never be extinguished, no matter how dark the night. Her voice broke as she asked, "Can I ever make things right? Can I undo the damage I've caused?" Prometheus looked at her, his eyes full of wisdom and understanding. You can't undo what's been done. But you can choose how you face it. You can choose to walk forward, knowing that the world will always be a balance of joy and sorrow. You can choose to help others find their way through the darkness, to show them that even in their worst moments, they are not alone. Pandora wiped away the tears that had gathered in her eyes. She felt a shift inside her, a sense of clarity, of understanding. Prometheus had shown her something vital, something she had overlooked in her quest to undo the past. It wasn't about fixing everything, it was about living with it, about helping others find their way through the storm, and about understanding that the storm would pass. The world is not yours to fix, Prometheus said softly, his voice filled with the weight of his experience. But it is yours to live in. And that, Pandora, is a privilege. Pandora looked at him, a sense of peace settling over her. The burden of guilt hadn't disappeared entirely, but now she understood that it was a part of her own story, just as the pain and suffering were a part of the world's story. There was no perfect answer, no way to undo the past. But there was a path forward, a path she could walk with others, helping them face the darkness and find the light. Prometheus smiled at her one last time. I've been where you are, Pandora. And I've seen the truth, suffering is a part of life. But so is redemption. And hope. And that, in the end, is all anyone can ask for. As he turned to leave, Pandora stood in the quiet, her heart finally beginning to understand the true meaning of the struggle. It wasn't about escaping pain, it was about embracing it, learning from it, and carrying it with you as you moved forward. The road would never be easy, but it was hers to walk, with all its shadows and light. And for the first time in a long time, she felt ready. Pandora stood in the dim light, the box before her, its fragile lid slightly ajar. The world outside was a chaotic, ever-changing scene, constant war, famine, disease, and despair. The echoes of human suffering reverberated in her mind, a constant reminder of the pain she had unleashed. Her heart was heavy, weighed down with guilt and regret, yet there was something else too, a glimmer of something stronger. It was hope. That faint, stubborn light that had not been extinguished, no matter how dark the world had become. She looked at the box. The small, delicate glimmer from within beckoned to her, pulling her in. This was the moment she had dreaded, the moment where she would face the consequences of all that had come before. The weight of it all pressed on her chest as she wondered if she should close it again. Lock it up. Put an end to the hope that had found its way back into the world. Because hope, as fragile and fleeting as it seemed, had a way of making everything seem possible. It gave people the strength to rise up against the suffering, to keep going even when the darkness felt too overwhelming. But was it enough? Was it worth the price? Could it survive amidst all the evil she had set free? Her fingers hovered over the lid. She had the power to close it again. To lock away hope, just as she had before. It would be the easy choice. No more struggling. No more pain. No more disappointment. The evil that had spread across the world would continue, but so would hope. Or so it seemed. She could shield herself and the world from that cruel reality. She could, in this moment, choose to close the box and make the pain stop, at least for a while. But deep inside, Pandora felt a stirring. A quiet whisper. A voice not of fear or guilt, but of understanding. Hope couldn't just be a fleeting thing. It couldn't be something that was only allowed when everything was perfect, when everything was at peace. Hope was not a luxury, it was a necessity. Without it, what would people have left to hold on to when the world turned its back on them? Without hope, there was nothing but despair. She remembered the faces of the mortals she had met, those who had fought to survive, even when everything seemed lost. Their strength had not come from the absence of suffering, but from their refusal to give up. They had endured the darkness, but they had also reached for the light. Hope had given them that strength. It had been a quiet force, but it had been enough. She had seen it in their eyes, the way they still believed that something better was possible, no matter how far away it seemed. Hope was the ember that kept the fire alive, no matter how cold the night. Pandora's breath caught as she realized what she had to do. The choice was clear, even if it was the hardest thing she would ever do. She couldn't shut hope away again. The world needed it. The people needed it. Even in the face of everything that had happened, hope was the only thing that could give them the strength to endure, to keep fighting, to keep believing. Without it, what would they have left? The power of choice weighed heavily on her now. This was her final moment, the last opportunity to decide what kind of world she wanted to live in. She could choose to lock away hope and leave humanity to face the darkness alone. Or she could choose to let it remain, knowing that it would never make the world perfect, but it would make the struggle worth it. She would never be able to erase the suffering she had caused, but she could give the world something that would help them survive it. Her fingers curled around the box, holding it steady, her heart beating louder than ever. There was no turning back now. She understood what Prometheus had meant when he said that suffering was not something that could be avoided, it was part of existence. And with it came the need for resilience, for strength, for hope. But she had also learned that hope wasn't something to hide away when the world was too broken. It was the very thing that could help rebuild it. Even in the smallest of actions, in the smallest of sparks, hope could ignite a fire that refused to be put out. Pandora knew she couldn't undo the past. She couldn't take back the evil that had been unleashed, nor could she shield humanity from the consequences of their suffering. But she could give them something to hold on to, a reason to keep going, even when the road ahead seemed impossible. The hope that had remained in the box was not just her burden to carry. It was her gift to the world. With a slow, deliberate motion, Pandora closed her eyes and let her fingers slowly close the lid, the final decision hanging in the balance. She felt the weight of the moment, the responsibility of the choice. But she also felt the light that had been growing in her heart, the certainty that this was the right thing to do. She wasn't closing the box to hide away hope. She was letting it remain. She was letting it spread. As the lid clicked shut, Pandora stepped back, her breath steady. She felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over her. The world would continue to struggle, yes. There would be suffering, there would be darkness, and there would be times when humanity felt like they couldn't go on. But there would also be light. There would be moments where people would come together, where they would rise above the odds and choose hope over despair. And in those moments, the world would feel a little less broken. And that, Pandora realized, was enough. Hope was a choice. It was a sacrifice, yes, but it was also a gift. The kind of gift that didn't promise an easy life, but it promised the strength to live it. The kind of gift that never left, no matter how dark the night. And in that moment, Pandora knew that she had made the right choice. The fire crackled softly, casting long shadows on the walls of the small, humble home. Outside, the wind howled, its bitter cold creeping into every crack. The world had changed, just as it always would. Mortals lived their lives, caught in the tension between light and darkness, joy and sorrow. But there was something else, something that had been passed down, generation after generation, etched into the hearts of those who had heard the stories. It was Pandora's story. The tale of a woman whose curiosity had opened the door to a flood of evil and suffering, only to reveal something deeper, hope. Her name had become a symbol, not just of human weakness, but of the fragile power that lay in the choice to carry on despite the overwhelming darkness. The world had always been a struggle, but her legacy was proof that the struggle was not in vain. Even in the depths of despair, there was a glimmer of something that could not be extinguished, the will to survive, to endure, and to hope. In the quiet of the night, a young child sat by the fire, listening intently to the voice of an elder. The elder's words were soft, but filled with weight, as if each syllable carried the knowledge of countless years. Pandora was not just a woman, the elder said, the firelight flickering across their wrinkled face. She was a reminder that we, too, are fragile. That even in our weakest moments, we hold within us the power to choose. And that choice, whether we choose to give in to despair or hold on to hope, will define us. The child's eyes were wide, drinking in the story, feeling the weight of the words in their bones. They could feel the pull of the past, the weight of the mistakes, and the brilliance of the hope that had remained despite everything. They were too young to understand all the nuances, but they could feel it in the air, the unspoken truth that the world was neither all good nor all evil. It was both. And it was in that balance that humanity's fate lay. Pandora's name was whispered on the wind, passed from one generation to the next, each telling of the story adding something new, some lesson learned, some reflection on the trials of life. The story had transformed over time, as stories do, but its core remained the same. It was about a woman who had dared to open the box and, in doing so, had changed everything. But more than that, it was about what she had left behind, a lesson that would echo through history. For centuries, people had looked to Pandora as both a warning and a guide. Her mistakes were as much a part of her as the hope she had left in the world. She had been cursed by the gods, blamed for all the evils that plagued mankind, but over time, her story had evolved. It had become clear that her curiosity, her human weakness, had led her to open the box, but it was her redemption, her acceptance of the consequences, and her ultimate decision to allow hope to stay in the world that defined her. It was a legacy of imperfection, a truth that resonated deeply with mortals. To be human was to be flawed. To make mistakes was inevitable. And yet, it was not the mistakes that defined a person, but what they chose to do in the aftermath. Pandora had been broken by what she had done, but she had also found the strength to keep moving forward. She had understood that the path to redemption was not an easy one, but it was a path worth walking. Generations grew up hearing her story, not as a tale of doom, but as a lesson in the complexities of existence. They heard it in their schools, in their homes, and in the songs sung by the firesides. Pandora had become a part of their collective memory, her story woven into the fabric of their culture. She was no longer just a woman from ancient times. She was an archetype, a symbol of the very human condition. People saw themselves in her struggle, in her guilt, in her hope. They saw how, despite everything, she had persevered, and in doing so, had given them the strength to keep going. They could feel her presence in the quiet moments when they, too, faced the darkness. And they knew that even in the worst of times, hope could still be found, sometimes in the most unlikely of places. Her legacy was not one of perfect morality, nor of a flawless hero. It was a legacy that understood that life was messy, that people were messy, and that even in the midst of our greatest failings, there was a way forward. Her story was about learning from mistakes, understanding the consequences, and, most importantly, choosing to live on. The fire that Pandora had sparked, small, flickering, fragile, had grown into a beacon for all to see. It was a symbol of the human spirit's ability to endure, even when everything else seemed to fall apart. The child looked up at the elder, eyes wide with wonder. "Is it true?" they asked, their voice barely above a whisper. "Is hope really enough?" The elder smiled gently, their eyes filled with a depth of understanding only time could give. "Hope is never the whole answer," they said softly, their voice filled with both certainty and tenderness. "But it is always the answer we need. Without hope, we are lost. With it, we find the strength to carry on." As the story was passed down once more, the child's heart swelled with a new understanding. They didn't need to understand everything yet. They didn't need to have all the answers. But they knew one thing: Pandora's legacy wasn't just about a woman opening a box. It was about what came after. It was about the choices we make when faced with pain, when the world seems to offer nothing but darkness. And most of all, it was about remembering that no matter how bad things got, hope would always find a way to shine through. Pandora's story would live on, as it had lived on for centuries, a testament to the fragility of humanity and the strength that came from choosing hope in the face of overwhelming odds. Her legacy would continue to teach, to heal, and to inspire, long after the fires had burned down and the winds had calmed. And in that, her story would remain timeless, carrying the lessons of history, not as a warning of what had been lost, but as a reminder of what had been gained. The sun broke through the clouds, its golden rays spilling across a world that had known darkness, yet now stretched toward the light. There was a quiet stillness in the air, as if the earth itself held its breath, waiting. People moved about their lives, carrying with them the weight of their past, but also something new, something brighter. The world was not free of sorrow, nor was it free of the evils that Pandora had unleashed. But now, it was different. Something had shifted. There was a pulse beneath the surface, a quiet, steady beat that refused to stop: hope. Pandora stood on the hilltop, watching as the world below slowly began to rebuild itself. It was not the same world she had once known. The fires of rage, the storms of despair, had all passed. The box was closed, but the lessons it had imparted lived on. Pandora no longer felt the weight of guilt pressing down on her. Her heart, once heavy with regret, now beat in time with the rhythm of life itself. She had learned that healing did not mean erasing the past. It meant learning to carry it, to live with it, and still choose to move forward. There was no magic solution to the evils of the world. They had not disappeared with the turning of a single page. Disease, war, and famine still visited, as they always had. But humanity had begun to understand something new. They had begun to understand that life was not simply about the absence of suffering. It was about how they responded to it. The strength to endure was not found in the removal of pain, but in the ability to face it, to survive it, and to find meaning in it. That was the essence of human resilience, the ability to rise, time and again, no matter how many times they were knocked down. Pandora watched a mother tending to her sick child. She saw the quiet determination in her eyes as she whispered words of comfort, even though she herself was tired, even though the world was weary. She watched as the farmers, after a harsh winter, gathered together to share what little food they had, knowing they were stronger when they worked as one. And in the cities, there were children who played in the streets, laughing, oblivious to the shadows of the past. It was not that they had forgotten. It was that they had learned how to live with what was and find joy despite it. The world was reborn not in the absence of darkness, but in the presence of hope, community, and resilience. It was in the simple, everyday acts of kindness, the kind that were born not from a place of perfection, but from the very human understanding that we all have flaws, we all have weaknesses, but that doesn't mean we cannot try. That doesn't mean we cannot help each other. It doesn't mean we can't be better than our worst moments. Pandora's gaze moved across the landscape, taking in the beauty of a world that still bore scars from the evil she had once unleashed. But those scars, too, told a story. They were reminders of what had been, and they held within them the strength of survival. They were not weaknesses. They were proof that despite everything, humanity had chosen to rebuild, to hope. There were days when Pandora wondered if she deserved this peace. After all, it was her hand that had opened the box. It was her curiosity that had given the evils of the world their entry. But then she would remember. She would remember the light she had seen in that box, the light of hope that had stayed behind. She realized that it had never been about perfection. It had never been about getting it right the first time or erasing the mistakes. It was about what came after the mistakes. It was about the strength to keep going, to keep hoping, even when the odds seemed impossible. Pandora saw it in the faces of the people who, despite their suffering, still smiled. She saw it in the laughter of children who had not yet learned that the world could be cruel. She saw it in the hands of the elders who had lived through pain, but had also lived through the quiet joys of each passing day. Hope was not some abstract concept. It was the very heartbeat of life, the pulse that kept people moving forward, one step at a time. The world was not perfect, nor would it ever be. But as long as there was hope, there was life. As long as there was hope, there was the possibility for change, for healing. And that was enough. Pandora had always feared that the world would never recover. She had believed that the consequences of her actions were irreversible. But now, as she stood in the quiet peace of the present moment, she understood something new. The world had not been broken beyond repair. It had been bruised, it had been battered, but it had not been destroyed. And neither had she. She had been a part of the story, not the whole of it. The world was bigger than her mistake, bigger than any one person. It was the people, the choices they made, and the strength they found in each other that had brought them back from the edge. Hope, Pandora realized, was not about erasing the past. It was about choosing to live in spite of it. It was about finding a way to keep going, to rebuild, to love, and to give and to dream. It was about acknowledging the darkness and still reaching for the light. It was about understanding that healing is not a destination, but a journey that never truly ends. And in that moment, Pandora felt at peace. The world would continue to change. It would go through its cycles of growth and decay, of joy and sorrow. But as long as humanity could hold on to hope, they would endure. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. She smiled softly as she watched the sun rise higher, its light breaking through the clouds, touching the earth with a warmth that felt like a promise that no matter how dark the world had been, it would always find its way back to the light.